The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli remains the most direct book ever written about the mechanics of power, a manual composed in early 16th-century Florence that still sits quietly and without ornament on the private shelves of people who inherit responsibility along with property. It matters because it refuses fantasy. It names the world as it is, not as preachers or poets might prefer it to be. Those who manage dynastic wealth read it to steady the hand, to understand the fragile seams where authority, reputation, and time are stitched together. When a family head faces a decision that will be spoken of for decades, this is the book that reminds them to look without fear. Machiavelli's language, stripped of flattery, introduces three instruments that never grow old. First, there is virtue, not virtue as goodness, but the trained capacity to act, to seize the narrow minutes when the conditions of a state or a firm are ready to be shaped. Second, there is fortuna, the weather of events, unruly and feminine in his metaphor, sometimes generous, often violent. Third, there is necessità, the hard constraint that makes indecision itself a decision. The Prince is an education in how these three forces meet. A prince must learn how not to be good, he writes, which is not a license for cruelty, but a warning that the world will demand choices that no catechism anticipates. He speaks about fear and love with the dryness of a treasurer, counting the liabilities of both. Better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both, he says, because fear rests on the sober pillar of punishment, while love rests on the weather of gratitude. Yet he adds the quiet clause that families of rank notice first: never be hated. Hatred corrodes the foundations of a house more quickly than a century of taxes. Old money hears in this the grammar of discretion. Appearances are not decoration, they are insurance. Men judge more by the eye than by the hand, he observes, and any estate manager knows that the eye proposes a story the accounts must confirm. Machiavelli's chapters on new principalities are read today as a discipline of succession. In a family enterprise, a new ruler, whether a duke or a chair of a holding company, must reweave loyalty without tearing the cloth that keeps creditors calm. The author's counsel is simple and severe. Keep the ancient taxes and customs where possible. Do not ridicule the laws you inherit. Plant a dwelling among your subjects, meaning be present, but appoint reliable ministers to do what must not be seen. The distance between the principal and the necessary hand is a moral instrument, not a clever trick. It allows policy to be firm, while the face remains constant. Even Machiavelli's famous discourse on cruelty, well used, is a chapter old families read with more sobriety than his critics. Cruelty well used is not the cultivation of harshness. It is the practice of swift, limited, and final measures that end uncertainty and spare the long suffering of hesitation. The historical record is full of houses that understood this in the language of reform rather than blood. When Cosimo I of the Medici consolidated the administrative offices of Tuscany, he ended a chaos of petty jurisdictions that had made both justice and revenue a theatre of chance. The move seemed severe to those who lost informal privilege, yet it created a reliable flow of public money and, with it, a steadier peace for merchants. A family can leave cruelty to rumour, but it must never leave disorder to rule. The book's most neglected lesson, and the one that matters most to inheritance, is the relentless insistence on memory. Machiavelli never says the word archive, but he writes like a keeper of ledgers. People remember injuries more vividly than benefits. They remember broken promises with perfect fidelity. They remember taxes that feel new and ignore those that continued quietly. Families that have lasted understand this arithmetic of recollection. The Borromeo in Lombardy did not simply build palaces on their islands. They built a pace of tradition that teaches visitors to remember certain gestures and forget others. In every season, the ritual reinforces an image of stewardship. Memory is engineered in public. then guarded in private. Consider the House of Nassau, which learned across centuries that public thrift and private liquidity are not contradictory, but cooperative virtues. The Orange inheritance seldom shouted. It operated as if it had read the paragraph in which Machiavelli advises a prince to arm his subjects by giving them reason to defend the order that defends them. The Dutch stadtholders cultivated a reputation for steady accounts and borrowed cheaply, then spent decisively when danger materialized. The coordination of reputation and force is exactly what the author means when he writes that Fortuna must meet a prepared hand. Those who wait for a perfect moment never find it. Those who prepare for the storm may recruit it. The Fuggers of Augsburg embodied Machiavelli's doctrine of necessità. When Emperor Charles needed his election debts masked within respectable instruments, the Fugger accounts found the form. Their power did not come from the theatre of a throne. It came from control over timing. They understood that in moments of necessity, a well-placed loan is policy by other means. The famous image of Anton Fugger burning imperial debt letters is not a portrait of arrogance, it is a lesson in symbolic closure, a stage where fear is converted into gratitude. Men judge by the eye, so the paper must be seen to vanish. The ledger following that fire, quite unseen, mattered more than the performance. And Machiavelli would have smiled. Beyond Europe, the Tokugawa shogunate offers a long study in Machiavellian prudence. The Tokugawa did not rely on perpetual war, they relied on perpetual preparation. Alternate attendance, the practice that required daimyo to maintain residences in Edo and leave their families there as living guarantors, is a form of hostage-taking refined into etiquette. It mastered the problem of distance without announcing terror. The prince teaches that a ruler must anticipate rebellion not with noisy punishments, but with structures that make rebellion costly and dull. The shogunate, by choreographing duty as travel and expense, created a lattice in which betrayal was a loss ledger rather than a romantic act. Old money understands the elegance of this. A well-designed rule dissolves the temptation to break it. Architecture, too, is Machiavellian. A house, a gallery, a chapel, if properly arranged, controls movement and therefore thought. The Farnese Palace reads like an index of command. The staircase at Chambord turns the visitor into a diagram. The Devonshire estate at Chatsworth places the river and the long view in a way that suggests the family's obedience to landscape, even as every line reveals control. Machiavelli would have noticed how entrances teach hierarchy without speaking. He would have approved the use of gardens as rooms of decision, where invitations can be granted or withheld with grace. Wealth that expects to endure chooses forms that instruct the eye to believe in its permanence. In the modern family office, the book appears as policy rather than ornament. A trust that limits distributions in order to protect the capital base is an example of cruelty well used. It prevents the slow ruin of generosity that is not matched by returns. A liquidity sleeve kept for rare events is virtu in financial clothing, the readiness to meet fortuna when the market breaks. Governance charters that separate the public face of the family from the investment committee, with clear authority and recorded minutes, are the civilized form of Machiavelli's preference for able ministers. The order looks gentle, but its bones are steel. The most discreet families also read the chapters on flatterers. The author insists that a ruler must invite truth without surrendering command. He suggests that wise counselors be allowed to speak plainly on matters where they are competent and be silent elsewhere. A family that hires a chief investment officer and then ignores him creates the very court of flattery the book condemns. A family that permits frank risk reports and adjusts allocations without humiliation practices exactly the balance the Florentine describes. In such rooms, one can feel an old air, the separations that allow candid speech and the settled courtesy that follows real authority. There are quieter examples, the kind one seldom finds in popular lists. The Borromeo cardinal who transformed Isola Bella into a Baroque allegory of rulership, understood that scale can be softened by taste. The Grimaldi of Monaco refined the tax haven into a theatre of law rather than piracy, adopting a rule of predictable small burdens in place of the heady chaos once associated with free ports. The English Cavendish line trained itself in scientific patronage, a choice that procured prestige without the vulgar noise of conquest. In each case, the families used the Machiavellian principle that stability is the hidden dividend of good administration. Machiavelli's harsh sentences are often read as pessimism. In private libraries, they are read as discipline. He knew that accidents ruin the unprepared, and that mercy without structure is a promise that dies at the first shock. He knew that reputation is a form of currency which, once debased, costs decades to restore. He knew that human beings love novelty but live by habit, and that the wise ruler reforms habits carefully, preserving names and rhythms while changing the mechanics beneath. That is how a new policy can wear old clothes, and why conservative surfaces often shelter the most radical repairs. The prince also contains a philosophy of time. He writes as if every decision leaves a shadow that moves forward. Old money families read this and translate it into education, succession, and the spacing of announcements. A successor introduced too early attracts envy. Introduced too late, he attracts doubt. Property moved too quickly from one structure to another wakes tax authorities and gossip. Moved too slowly, it is eroded by fees and mispricing. The correct rhythm is almost never public. It is the slow, steady pulse of private calendars, quarter by quarter, generation by generation, where each action seems ordinary, while the shape of the future changes. What, then, does the book teach those who will inherit a title or a firm? It teaches that power is not a costume but a cadence. It teaches that disorder is an enemy more dangerous than scandal. It teaches that a house must look calm while its machine works. It teaches that ministers are not decoration, they are causeways over which policy walks. It teaches that some acts must be finite and early, so that ordinary life may continue. It teaches that fortune favours the hands that are already moving, and punishes the eyes that stare. The endurance of the prince among the well-born is not a mystery. It is a mirror without makeup. In its pages, families see their own risks described without euphemism, and they see a path out of the fog. The book has survived not because it is cruel, but because it respects reality. In long galleries where portraits watch the seasons, in offices where cash flows and timber yields and dividend cover are charted with accuracy, the Florentine's small volume rests within reach. It is taken down when the choice is not between good and evil, but between two necessary harms. It is consulted when a marriage of assets must be arranged, or a minister must be replaced, or a beloved tradition must be amended to save the rest. There are bolder books that promise the glamorous fire of conquest. There are softer books that promise the gentle sleep of harmony. The prince offers neither. It offers the truth that every house is a small state, that every state is a fragile settlement of interests, and that prudence is a craft taught by failure. That is why dynasties keep it near. They do not worship it, they use it. They read it quietly, and then return to their calendars, their trustees, their architects, their head gardeners, and their council. The book becomes a habit of mind, the modest instrument by which families rescue themselves from illusion. In the end, the most faithful tribute to Machiavelli is a well-run household, light along a gravel path at the correct hour, accounts balanced, tenants content, a firm hand on the helm and a face that does not tremble. The prince endures because the world endures in the same shape, difficult, unstable, and full of chance. Great fortunes that last are not the gifts of luck. They are the result of practiced attention. That is the private meaning of the book in rooms where privacy matters. It is not a scandal. It is survival written as prose.